Three places, three countries, thousands of kilometers apart. Three stories the rest of the world has already decided it understands. Turn on the news and you hear the same words each time: ancient hatreds, tribal conflict, a continent that cannot govern itself. The explanation is always old, always internal, and always African. There is a problem with that story. The hatreds are not ancient, the borders are barely 140 years old, and the systems tearing these countries apart were, for the most part, designed somewhere else. This video asks a harder question. If the hatreds are not ancient, then where does the violence actually come from? Trace it back far enough, and the trail leads out of Africa altogether into the map rooms of 19th century Europe. In the winter of 1884, 14 governments, almost all of them European, sat down in Berlin around a large map of a continent that few of them had ever walked across. Over the months that followed, they drew the borders of Africa. They drew them with rulers, they cut through kingdoms and trade routes that had organized life for centuries, and they grouped together peoples who had never shared a state. Not one African was in the room. The borders were only the beginning. Each colony was built for a single purpose: to move wealth out. Rubber, copper, gold, cotton, labor. The roads ran from the mines to the ports and stopped there. The administration existed to keep the extraction flowing. This was the machine. A state shaped like a funnel, wide at the bottom where the resources were and narrow at the top where they left. Underneath the machine sat an idea. European political thought arrived carrying a particular picture of the human being, the individual as an owner, separate, self-interested, and competing with every other individual for scarce things. The picture was written into law, the economy, and the border itself. It replaced something. Across much of the continent, personhood had been differently understood. A person became a person through other persons. Your existence was bound up with your neighbors. Land was held in common and stewarded across generations rather than owned and sold. Disputes were settled to repair a relationship rather than to produce a winner. The Nguni languages of Southern Africa carry a word for this: Ubuntu. Ubuntu was never sentiment. It was a working theory of how to hold a society together, one of many African systems tested over long stretches of time and that the imported machine was designed to override. To see what happens when that machine meets the ground and keeps running long after the colonizers go home, look at three countries in crisis right now. Start in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There is no pure example of the extraction machine. In 1885, the territory was handed as private property to a single European monarch, King Leopold II of Belgium. Not to the Belgian nation, to the man himself. He never set foot there. He ran it as a rubber plantation the size of Western Europe, enforced by a private army that took hostages, burned villages, and severed the hands of workers who missed their quotas. Historians estimate the population fell by millions during those years. When former colonialism ended, the machine did not. In 1960, Congo chose its first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, a man who spoke openly about controlling the country's resources for the benefit of its own people. He lasted a matter of months. In January 1961, 65 years ago, he was captured, beaten, and shot with the involvement of Belgian officials and the backing of Western intelligence during the Cold War. In his place, the West installed and protected Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled over 3 decades. He looted the country and kept its wealth flowing outwards for the right buyers, and for that he was rewarded as a reliable Cold War ally. The funnel kept working. Only the owner's name had changed. Today the resource is different and the pattern is identical. Eastern Congo holds some of the largest deposits on earth of coltan, the ore refined into the metal inside almost every phone and laptop in the world. The Rubaya mine alone supplies somewhere between 15 and 30% of global coltan trade. Since 2021, an armed group called the M23, backed by neighboring Rwanda, according to United Nations experts, has seized much of the region. In early 2025, it captured the cities of Goma and Bukavu. More than 7 million people are now displaced inside the country, one of the largest displacement crises anywhere on the planet. UN investigators estimate several thousand Rwandan troops operate across the border, and that armed groups tax the coltan as it leaves, funding the war with the very mineral the world's technology runs on. The global press calls it an ethnic conflict. Ethnicity is present, yes, but the engine underneath is the same funnel Leopold built, still wide at the mine and narrow at the port, still moving Congo's wealth to everywhere except Congo. Now we move north to Sudan. When Britain and Egypt ruled Sudan, they governed it as two countries pretending to be one. The north administered as Arab and Muslim, the south and west as African and separate. Colonial policy hardened a spectrum of identity into a hard line and then invested in the center while starving the edges. Khartoum and the river received the schools, the roads, the investment. Darfur in the far west received almost nothing. That inequality was a design choice, and it outlived the empire that made it. In Darfur, land had long been organized through a communal system called the Hakura, which tied families to territory and gave local leaders a way to manage grazing, farming, and the disputes between herders and cultivators. It was a mechanism for sharing a harsh environment. The centralizing state that replaced it saw only a periphery to be controlled. When drought and decades of neglect turned herders against farmers in the early 2000s, the government in Khartoum armed a militia drawn from the region, the Janjaweed, and unleashed it on Darfur's African communities. Estimates of the dead reached around 200,000. The militia was never disbanded. It was renamed, formalized, and folded into the state as the Rapid Support Forces. In April 2023, the Rapid Support Forces and the National Army turned on each other, and the entire country became a battlefield. The numbers now are hard to hold in the mind. Around 14 million people driven from their homes, the largest displacement crisis in the entire world. Tens of thousands killed by the fighting directly, with credible estimates running far higher once hunger and disease are counted. Confirmed famine in El Fasher, which fell in October 2025 amid reports of mass killing. And once again, outside hands are on it. Gold leaves the country, and foreign powers, including Gulf states, named repeatedly by the United Nations investigators, are reported to arm the sides that serve their interests. The framework that produced this was never Sudanese, a centralized extraction state, an inherited hierarchy of who counts and who does not, and a communal system for sharing scarcity that was dismantled and left with nothing in its place. What remained was a machine for concentrating power at the center, and in the end, it consumed the center too. Finally, come south to the continent's most developed economy, South Africa. Here, the machine took its most refined form. The gold and the diamond mines that built Johannesburg ran on a system that pulled in African labor from across the whole region, from Mozambique, Lesotho, Malawi, Zimbabwe, worked it in the mines, housed it in single-sex hostels, and sent it home when it was used up. The economy was built from the very start on migrant African workers who were wanted for their labor and denied any belonging. Apartheid then wrote the logic into every corner of life, ranking human beings by race, engineering where they could live and work and move. In 1994, apartheid ended, and the world watched one of the great moral victories of the century. The economic machine underneath was left largely intact. The new government adopted an orthodox economic program, shaped in large by the expectations of international lenders and markets that prioritize stability and investor confidence over the deep redistribution the movement demanded. Growth came. The ownership of the economy and the vast gap between rich and poor barely moved. South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies on earth. Millions of black South Africans were promised liberation and received a flag, a vote, and a permanent place at the bottom of an economy someone else still owned. That is a dangerous amount of unspent anger, and anger, when it cannot reach the people who actually hold the power, looks for someone closer and weaker. Found the foreigner, the Zimbabwean running a small shop, the Malawian looking for work, the Somali trader. Since 2008, when a wave of attacks killed 62 people, more than 430 have been killed in xenophobic violence, according to Xenowatch, the University of Witwatersrand. In 2021, a movement called Operation Dudula emerged. It's named meaning force out. By 2026, vigilante groups were setting deadlines for undocumented Africans to leave, blocking migrant children from clinics, and driving tens of thousands to flee. The tragedy was a bitter symmetry. The poorest South Africans failed by an economy that was never rebuilt for them, turning on the poorest migrants who were failed by the same machine one border away. Both are standing at the narrow end of the same funnel, fighting each other for the little that reaches them. And the philosophy that this violence tramples is the one that South Africa gave the world its clearest word for: Ubuntu. I am because we are. The idea that my humanity is bound to yours. Xenophobia is Ubuntu turned inside out, the scarcity logic of the imported machine finishing the job the border began. 3 countries, 3 crises, the world files under African dysfunction, and underneath all 3, the same inheritance: a border drawn in Europe, an economy built to drain outward, a philosophy of scarcity and separation that set neighbor against neighbor and called it human nature. It is worth being clear about what this argument does and does not claim. It does not claim that Africans bear no responsibility for the choices made since independence. Leaders have stolen and betrayed their own people. Those choices, though, were made inside a machine built to produce exactly these outcomes, and the machine is almost never named. It is worth being just as clear about what came before it. The African systems the machine replaced were not perfect, and they are not frozen in some golden past. They were living, adaptable ways of organizing land, power, and belonging. Ubuntu in the south, the Hakura in the Sahel, and hundreds of others tested across centuries, capable of holding diverse societies together without tearing them apart. They were dismissed as primitive precisely because they stood in the way of extraction. But that points to the way out. If this crisis grew from an imported system, the answer will not be found in importing another one. It will be found in Africans returning to their own intellectual inheritance and building institutions from it, designed for African conditions and answerable to African people. That conviction has a name: the African Renaissance, the belief that Africa's future has to be designed by Africans, drawing on African philosophy and African terms. It is the founding idea of the African Renaissance Foundation, and it cuts directly against 60 years of being told that development is something that arrives from outside with conditions attached. The wars in Sudan and Congo and the violence in the streets of South Africa are what the old machine produces when it is left to run. The question this generation has to answer is whether Africa keeps feeding that machine or finally builds its own. The Renaissance will not be imported.